In this second full week of the campaign, the agenda analyzed the party's offerings for post-secondary institutions and to boost manufacturing. We considered what role performance plays in success at the polls and sat down with Green Party leader Mike Schreiner. The agenda's week in review begins sizing up how the leaders did in the province-wide debate on Monday night. They've been making the point, David Hurley and Scott Reid, that the opposition parties have spent far too much time rolling out their platforms and not nearly enough time bashing Doug Ford's brains in. And I wonder whether, let's go around on this. Alison, do you think there was enough attacking the king, which after all, if you want to be the king, you got to beat the king? Did enough of that happen tonight?
I don't think so. I don't think enough of that happened at the Northern debate either. And Doug Ford really has a unique and keen sense of brushing that stuff off. I mean, even when he was being attacked on the pandemic, I mean, Stephen Del Duca got very specific. He said, you closed parks, you got police involved. And that is something that people really did not like Doug Ford for. That was another really political, terrible zone for him at that point. But Doug Ford was able to, he was just kind of like, well, I apologized and I worked 24/7. Kind of, what else do you want me to do about it? And I think, again, he kind of got off scot-free and blamed the Liberals for not having a PPE backlog and our stockpile, it had expired. And I'm not sure it hurt Doug, and I don't know what will. He's I've said it before, but he's been a real Teflon Don throughout this campaign, and it's tough to get under his skin. And that's it seems like a lot of debate prep training and staying on message. And like I said off the top of this, he just really has to not completely lose voters, and he's golden, and I think he knows that, and it seems to be working.
Jackie, did your party and the other opposition parties this evening hammer away at Doug Ford adequately enough?
I certainly think that Mike did that. He held Ford's feet to the fire on the environmental protections that he's rolled back, on his, attack on the healthcare system and on the education system. And I think that, as we've mentioned here tonight, he'd be the first one to say it's not likely on June 2nd that Mike will be the premier of this province, but it is a lot more likely that we could elect more Green MPPs in this province and hold the balance of power. And I think that Mike's performance tonight showed that having more Green MPPs, having more Green voices at Queen's Park to hold if it is Ford at the end of the day who retains power here, having Greens holding the government to account and being really clear about the things that he needs to do differently will result in better leadership in this province. Will result in not going as far on the environmental protection rollbacks that Ford has already done, and will actually result in a better democracy here.
Cameron, do you think Andrea Horwath adequately and with enough force attacked Doug Ford to create some doubt in the public's mind?
I think she did. And I think we have to remember, too, here, I think this is somehow dealing with somebody like Doug Ford. Doug Ford is a political street fighter, and his most comfortable place is to be in that street fight. You need to beat him in a way where you're not playing his game. You can go after the king and take out the king, but you're not going to beat this king by playing the king's game. And I think that's the way to look at this, is that at the end of the day, if you're going to beat Doug Ford, it's by showing yourself to be competent, showing you have the plan to actually do it. Because if you're going to get down in the mudslinging and you're going to get down in the name calling, that's where Doug Ford lives. That's where the Fords have lived their entire political career and made a connection out of it. So you're not going to beat them at their own game. And I think that's something that maybe, I know it's tempting. Like I say, there's some things that Doug Ford does that frustrates the living heck out of me because it's just so wrong. But at the same time, it's like if I spend all my time dealing with all the falsehoods he throws out there and trying to correct them, I'm not doing my job. I'm busy trying to correct whatever he's throwing out there. You really have to put your blinders on and stay focused. And I'll admit, it doesn't make for the sexiest television you'll ever watch in your life. It won't make for the greatest debate ever, but that's kind of how you have to beat him. And we'll see if it's successful or not. But fighting it his way, that's definitely not going to succeed unless you're better at it. And frankly, I don't think anyone's better at being Doug Ford than Doug Ford.
Well, you expressed your frustration on that. Hurley and Reid, Ashley, have been expressing their frustration that the Liberal leader has seemed to want to spend a great deal of time rolling out policy pronouncements and not nearly, in their judgment, enough time, as I say, colloquially speaking, bashing Doug Ford's political brains in. Did Stephen Del Duca do an adequate job of that tonight?
I think he did a really good job of balancing opposition and proposing something new and better, because people aren't necessarily just going to vote against something. They also want something to vote for. And I think he struck that balance. There were some good heated moments that spoke to a lot of the passions and frustrations that I think a lot of people across this province have felt. And I think he did a good job of showing himself as the alternative to Doug Ford, and, not necessarily spending a lot of time attacking the other two non-conservative leaders on the stage. And I think that was a bit of a contrast with Ms. Horvath. But, it is really hard to mount a case for change when the polling numbers are what they are, and when Ford does have this kind of folksy populist kind of mantle still wrapped around him. Like, he is fairly popular. So if you go too hard against him, that can also blow back against you. So I think that the team around Stephen Del Duca have had a really tough time striking that balance. And I get the pugilistic kind of impulse that Reid and Hurley are talking about. And I have worked with them. I respect them immensely. And I also understand the more measured and policy-driven approach and positive campaign that the current team is rolling out.
Conservative candidates out there on the hustings are not showing up to all candidates' debates in their ridings. They're not giving interviews to journalists. It's classic front-runner stuff. They just are terrified about doing anything or saying anything that might get a headline for a day that might embarrass somebody. And I just want to know, I get that. Does it do a service to voters to play this kind of peekaboo campaign?
Well, I think you do have to be accessible to voters and make sure that you're knocking on doors regularly, making yourself available in a number of different forums. Yes, this is very classic message control maneuver that happens for frontrunner campaigns and other campaigns as well. So I think there has to be a balance there, Steve, of course, between being seen to hide and making yourself available to voters. And one thing you can say about Doug Ford, I know the record in question period came up. I don't think that lands as well if Doug Ford's not having his usual press conference, if Doug Ford's not giving interviews, but he was doing all of those things every day during the pandemic, well after Justin Trudeau and the other premiers had quit their daily press conference. Doug Ford was up there talking about what he was going to do. So I think that the criticism that the PCs and Premier Ford are at all absent just won't land with voters.
Is there one leader in particular that you believe their performance skills are head and shoulders above everybody else's? Lynn, why don't you start us off?
Hi, Steve. I think so. And I think it was demonstrated last night quite well. And that's Mike Schreiner. When you think about leadership and the qualities that one has to demonstrate in this kind of format, authenticity, empathy, and a recent study from Auckland University and the University of Calgary just a year ago indicated also a sense of collaboration and likability are the key qualities to demonstrate in a political campaign, and definitely in a debate. And he did really well in that category. His empathy, that question, Mr. Ford, have you talked to a nurse? Demonstrated his understanding. His ability also to show that he was collaborative just by how he reacted physically to different leaders in that split screen situation, also was very, very effective. So I would say thus far that he really is demonstrating that quality that both media and voters like to see in a leader.
All right, there's one vote for the Green leader, Mike Schreiner. Karen Stintz, you've done this before. As a mayoral candidate, you've participated in these kinds of all candidates debates. So tell me, is there one leader that you've seen on the hustings so far who has impressed you more than all the others?
Well, it's hard, as you know, Steve, when you're doing these kinds of debates, it's hard to get your message out. It's hard to put on a good performance. And as you know, that there is the ability for politicians to connect one-to-one, the ability for politicians to connect one to the many. And I would say that Doug Ford continues to be able to excel at connecting to the one-to-many. That he has a message that seems to resonate with the masses. And I would say he's also probably the most authentic to himself. He doesn't try to be overly articulate. In fact, you wonder sometimes whether he chooses the language that he does so that he can be seen to be, one of the guys. But I saw him last night in the debate, and he was serious at times. He was trying to be chummy at other times, and he was actually, reached across the aisle to Mike Schreiner. And so I thought he was the most able to articulate his message because he seemed to be the one that was most comfortable in the delivery of his message.
Kathy Brog, in terms of performance skills, any one of them any much better than all the rest?
Actually, Steve, I would have a tie between Doug Ford and Mike Schreiner. Both of them spoke well. Mike Schreiner came across as very forthright. He reacted honestly. He was frank when he answered questions. So that came across very positively. And that's what voters are looking for, someone who's real. In the same way, Doug Ford came out. He was very positive in his opening remarks. He repeated the word yes a number of times, and get it done, his slogan, but it's a slogan that seems to work. But what struck me most was when Doug Ford was asked about the pandemic, and he said it was the most challenging time of his life, and that he would never wish this on another premier, and he will ensure it never happens, ever. And he added that ever, and that was genuine.
MRC, what say you?
Well, I agree with everyone that Mike Schreiner was head and shoulders above the rest. He has been, it's interesting, this was his first televised provincial debate. And so he, in that sense, he was a rookie because he didn't have the seat before that led him onto the stage. He didn't have the seat in the legislature. But he's been leader for 13 years. People don't realize that. He's been leader as long as Andrea Horwath has been leader of the NDP. He's been leader of the Greens. And so you had a tale of two 13-year leaders, one of whom didn't seem to have the energy or the connection to viewers last night. It was interesting that Andrea Horwath talked a few times. She likes to tell that anecdote. I met Kathy on the assembly line last week. I met so-and-so at childcare. I met Eve at the school or the nurse. And yet she wasn't actually connecting with viewers last night. Didn't have the energy, didn't have the emotion. Let's talk about emotion for half a second here, because that's something that Doug Ford delivers on. And although you can sometimes have too much of a good thing, too much positivity, and it begins to sound a bit phony. I love nurses. I love educators. I love firefighters. I love first responders. At a certain point, Mike Schreiner was able to call him out on that. And do you actually talk to nurses? Do you hear what they're saying to you? But clearly, on the emotional front, Mike Schreiner connected. And let me just quickly say, he was passionate. But he was more sad than mad. He wasn't angry when he attacked the Doug Ford or even Del Duca or Horwath. He went after everybody last night, and yet you would think he was Mr. Nice Guy. Very interesting ability to do that.
I think looking back on the past 4 years, there really was first a major shift in policy from what we've seen in the over the past, say, 10 or 15 years that we had the relationship with the McGuinty and Wynne government and Liberal government. That's not unexpected in a change. And as a sector, we've experienced many governments throughout our existence, and even to a certain extent predating the parties. So adapting to that change has been difficult. I would say the combination of uncertainty and change compounded together made it very difficult. So for example, I think a lot of people are aware of the 10% tuition reduction that was brought in by the current Conservative government. That in and of itself was brought in rather quickly. So we've had to absorb that in the middle of the budgeting process. And as a sector, we're course loading years out. We're making investments in infrastructure years out. We're working with our faculty years out. We're working with our student population and staff years out. So absorbing a 10% and then, in fact, if you add another 3% because there was an ongoing tuition increase in one whole year really was difficult. Now, others on the panel have also mentioned the reality of multi-year stable funding or just a multi-year framework of funding. That's something that we've been seeking to as a partner with the Queen's Park. We're always looking to Queen's Park as one of our #1 partners. And so having a multi-year funding flexibility is really important. So there's that element, but then there's the element, and it's really the elephant in the room, of the pandemic. So you kind of have to look at, or at least I look at from the sector, there's what the government was doing from policy and programmatic changes in the beginning of their mandate to what they were doing during the pandemic. And through the pandemic, they have been listening to us as a whole, us as a sector. So we are appreciative of that. I think a lot of the policy got pushed to the side. We're seeing cues, as others have mentioned, within the recent budget of where we're going. And so just catching up with that and dealing with the combination of the uncertainty and change is always difficult.
All right, Glenn, I want to follow up with you on the tuition freeze situation because, of course, by freezing tuition, the government has essentially frozen potential revenues to your institutions to make them better. And all of this in a world where inflation's running at whatever, 5, 6, 7%. So I presume, well, you tell me, what kind of impact has this had on your ability to deliver a quality education to all the college and in the other cases, university students across the province?
No, great question, and others have mentioned it as well. And when you look at funding, you really have to look at the overall funding model for colleges and universities. And I have to say, and it irks me, if I'm allowed to say that, it really irks me when tuition policies combine universities and colleges. And that always happens. It's happened my entire career. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at college tuition separately, it's among the lowest in the country. Versus, university education in Ontario is among the highest, but we always get lumped into the same category, and as a result, it creates all kinds of challenges for colleges. So, one of the things that we'd like to see is a separate tuition policy for colleges, one that ensures that government invests in colleges, government invests in students, and continues to make colleges accessible, because that's what we're about as a system. But I have to say, we'd really like to see a separate tuition policy between colleges and universities.
Mitra, you're on the university side of things, and I should ask you, if a party comes into power pledging to freeze tuition for 3 or 4 years, you would think students would love that, do they?
Well, I think the way that I like to think about tuition freezes is like, without accounting for public funding, it's really going to put a burden on international and out-of-province students, as institutions are going to scramble to make up for that loss of revenue in a way. Freezes are temporary solutions to a more permanent issue of high tuition fees and lack of publicly funded structure. So in reality, we need more sustainable solutions like investing in free publicly funded education to increase, again, access to higher education, recognizing that yes, the freeze is going to let people that are already in post-secondary education to continue, but it doesn't necessarily increase access for folks that don't have access to post-secondary education to begin with.
I think the Conservative government has made, has made some choices, and I think they really are quite broad scale, and it really builds on that transportation and machine building history of this province. No real quibbles with any of the parties. I think training is really important. How you get there, how you get that training, whether it's tax credits at the employer level, especially for SMEs, or it's more broad adjustments to the colleges. I think that we're all going in the same direction.
Okay, Eleni, what jumped out at you as being something you think is really useful among the party platforms?
I agree that there is a certain similarity across all these platforms, and they're all locating discussions about manufacturing within this broader transition to achieve our net zero goals, right? So decarbonizing the economy, decarbonizing manufacturing. which is great. What I really like is these conversations. They do talk and they address those shortages, those challenges that we have just identified not long ago in terms of skills, increasing the pool of workers and investments, access to investment. One thing that I feel that is lacking is a broader conversation about, as my colleague here has just identified, how are we going to do that? How are we going to train those? How are we going to create those opportunities for people, for workers to firms to not only attract workers but retain those workers, especially workers from equity deserving groups? How are we going to achieve that? So I feel that there needs to be a broader conversation about manufacturing, not as an isolated sector in our economy, but in communication with other sectors as well, higher education, other partners, other stakeholders, other sectors of the economy. How can we together collaborate and ensuring that manufacturing remains a powerhouse in Ontario's economy?
Dennis, do you have a view in terms of responding to the concern Aline just raised there?
Yeah, I think what we're speaking about here is that where high tech goes to produce GDP is in manufacturing. So you're right. We have to first of all incentivize employers, when they make new hires, to help them train and develop those employees. If there's data from Europe and countries like Germany and Italy and France where they do that does drive some loyalty. So number one, if you train them and provide that career advancement and the knowledge build, you'll keep them. Number two, we need to make sure, and this is good, we're having a provincial discussion today, Steve, because normally at the federal level, the federal government can just sort of throw money to the provinces and how they spend it, is up to them, and it's hard to coordinate. Here's where Ontario can actually be in the lead and say, okay, we're going to help bring more STEM graduates in. We're going to help get more of them, the people who are in the current, maybe got displaced during COVID, how do we get them the skills they need? So I think there's a strong need to have a real concrete plan because, aside from labor and supply chain and investment, other than that, everything's fine. But in this particular case, labor is the one that we probably can act on, I think, the most quickly.
You did make history, as we suggested last night, in as much as this was the first time at a province-wide televised debate that there were 4 leaders on stage instead of 3. What do you think you brought to that debate stage that was different enough to warrant your inclusion this time?
Well, first of all, I believe we earned our inclusion. The debate consortium said you have to elect an MPP and you need to have a full slate of candidates, and we accomplished that and made history last night. But I think I brought a level of honesty and authenticity to the debate that was really appealing to viewers, and I think that's been a big part of the feedback I've received. And I also think there were some issues that were brought up last night that maybe wouldn't have been talked about as much. One, the climate crisis, which I think I was the only leader to really talk about it until the very last question that you brought up towards the end of the debate. And the other one is poverty. Nobody else really talked about poverty until I brought up the fact that the Ontario Greens are looking to double social assistance rates to end legislative poverty in this province. And those are 2 important issues that I think need to be a part of the political conversation here in Ontario.
People are going to be considering over the next period of time, couple of weeks, who they want to put their ex beside on Election Day. And I do hear this when I'm out there on the hustings. I hear people say, why should I vote for Green? You guys aren't going to be the next government. Is it a wasted vote? Could you address that to people who are wondering whether it is a wasted vote to give it to you?
It's not a wasted vote to vote for the Ontario you want. If you want Green, vote Green. And we've seen what a huge influence even one Green MPP can make. Many media commentators, I think maybe even including yourself, Steve, have said I punch well above my weight at Queen's Park and have an outsized influence. Imagine what we can accomplish with 2 or 3 Green MPPs, and we've seen that in other provinces. So British Columbia, 3 Green MLAs held the balance of power in a minority government. In PEI, the Greens are the official opposition in a minority government. So we believe we have an opportunity to maximize our influence to improve the lives of Ontarians.
Can you give us one issue where you think your being in that legislative chamber made a difference to what otherwise might have happened?
Yeah, Doug Ford proposed a ministerial zoning order to build an Amazon warehouse on the Duffins Creek wetland. I immediately spoke out against it and really led and sparked a citizens movement against it until that ministerial zoning order was pulled. I'll give you one other example. In the early days of the Ford government, they said they were going to reopen the Greenbelt Act and potentially allow development in the Greenbelt and review the Clean Water Act and partly undermine the Clean Water Act. Again, literally the minute that legislation was introduced, I was up at Queen's Park speaking out against it. And again, we built a citizens movement, and the Ford government backtracked on that schedule of the bill and said, you know what? Hands off development in the Greenbelt. And quite frankly, other than Mr. Ford wanting to build his highways through the Greenbelt, they have said nothing about doing development in the Greenbelt, and I think it's because of a firm opposition led by one Green MPP.
Well, I don't know if you've had a chance to watch the debate because you were there, but here's a little bit of it. Sheldon, if you would.
The Bradford bypass. When a golf course donor said, hey, we don't want it through our golf course, he rerouted it around them. He will roll out the red carpets for the Amazons of the world and the big box stores of the world. But when it comes to supporting local farmers, he'll pave over their farmland, hurting our economy. When it comes to protecting us from flooding and the climate change, he'll pave over the wetlands that clean our drinking water and protect us.
First time. Were you nervous?
I was a little nervous going into it, I'll have to be honest with you, but I think a little nerves are good because it keys you up and gives you the energy you need and sometimes the focus you need on what you want to accomplish when you're on the stage.
I was impressed about the fact that when I asked that question at the end about what's the decision you regret the most in public life, frankly, you were the only guy who really gave a thoughtful, heartfelt answer about wishing you had run in Guelph from the beginning as opposed to all the way along. You didn't get a heads up on that question, right? So where'd that come from?
You know, it came from the heart. I would say almost everything I said last night came from the heart. And I think people are hungry for a politician who's authentic and is honest. And, you know, just saying that, you know, I made a strategic mistake in the 2011 election, and I learned from that mistake.
And now you're the MPP for Guelph.
And now I'm the
you
MPP
were the
for
MPP
Guelph.
for Guelph, seeking re-election there. That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website. That's tvo.org. Our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, that's twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.